types of bones and different bone membranes, cells, etc. Um, the first slide is talking about something that I touched on in the last lecture called a periosteum. And a periosteum is a protective layer of connective tissue that is on the outside of the diaphysis or shaft of the bone. It's dense, regular connective tissue. So dense connective tissue, we learned are tendons and ligaments from chapter 4, but they also make up some other types of tissues. And so one of them is the periosteum. And what the periosteum is a protective membrane. So it has to be able to be attached or secured to the bone itself, because it is connective or dense regular connective tissue. So it's not bone. So it's secured by these things called sharpies or perforating fibers. And they're just basically a series of fibers that is holding on. One side's attached to the bone, one side's attached to the periosteum. The endosteum is on the medullary cavity, so it's on the inside of the bone, and it lines the medullary cavity, just allowing for the surface to be smooth inside the bone itself. So we talked a lot about the structure of long bones in the last lecture, and today we're going to touch on the other types of bones that we have in our body. We have short, irregular, flat bones all throughout our body, and they're definitely a different composition than the long bone. So in the short, irregular, and flat bones, there is a periosteum, and there is an endosteum, but it's definitely different than the long bone, as we've talked about. So it says thin plates of periosteum cover the compact bone on the outside. Again, it's that protective connective tissue covering. And then there is an endosteum on the inside. There's a new word, as you guys can see. This word here, diploe. And diploe is just another word for spongy bone. In these short, irregular, and flat bones, there's no diaphysis, no shaft, and there is no epiphyses or ends to it, because a long bone definitely looks a little different. And there is bone marrow between the trabecula, and that's a term that we talked about earlier in this unit, and that is just basically the bony portions of spongy bone. So you can see in a flat bone, there's compact bone on the outside, there's the periosteum on the outside, there's going to be an endosteum here where you see the spongy bone or diploe, and right here, these kind of bony portions.
And you said you had 2 meter bottles?
Portion that you can see where my pointer is, that is what we consider the trabecula, and then there's just holes in the spongy bone. Now, it says there's a big word at the top, and it says hematopoietic tissue, and hematopoiesis is the formation of blood cells. And so this happens in red bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is just there to store fat, and red bone marrow is where we're going to produce our blood cells. So in infants, when we were smaller, we had red bone marrow basically everywhere. It was in the medullary cavity of the bone, where now, as an adult, we have yellow bone marrow in the medullary cavity. So in infants, we're trying to make as many blood cells as we possibly can, because we're just developing, we're trying to form an immune system, etc. And so we have a lot more red bone marrow. And then in adults, we just find it in the diploe, which is just spongy bone. It's just the scientific word for spongy bone. And at the head, which is the diaphysis, the epiphyses of the femur and the humerus, and that also has spongy bone. So we're just going to basically find our red bone marrow as adults in spongy bone as opposed to every bone in the body. Now, when we're looking at the microscopic structure of bone, which you guys did in chapter 4 when we were looking at the different tissues, because bone, if you remember, is a connective tissue, it has something called a Haversian system or osteon. And an osteon, and we discussed this in chapter 4, but an osteon are those concentric circles, the entire concentric circle that you see in a compact bone. So we consider it to be the structural unit of compact bone, and so it has some parts to it. So the first part is called a lamella, and a lamella is the weight-bearing portion of the bone, so it's going to be the solid portion of the bone. All of the matrix that we talked about, all of those calcium salts and etc., and then there's collagen fibers in there also, because the matrix is fibers and ground substance. Then you have something called a Haversian canal or central canal, and that is going to be the central portion of the osteon that is just a tube, and it contains blood vessels and nerves to go through, because they have to be able to get, nerves and blood vessels have to get through the bone, and bone is solid, and so because it's solid there has to be holes or canals for everything to get through. Then you have something called a Volkmann canal. The Haversian canal goes down the middle of the osteon. Volkmann's canals are going to be lying at right angles to the central canal. So they're going to go through horizontally through the bone itself. And again, it's just a way to make sure that we get blood and nerve supply to all of the bone cells and the periosteum. Then the mature bone cells that live in that little lacunae that we talked about a couple of chapters ago are called osteocytes. So osteo means bone, cytes mean cells, so they're mature bone cells. And then that lacunae is just that little bubble that it lives in. And then here's a new word, and it's kind of a long word, but it's called canaliculi. And canaliculi are outside of the lacunae. They're these little teeny tiny like cracks. And again, they're allowing for things to get in or out of the cell itself. So that cell needs to be nourished just like any other cell, but it's surrounded by a hard, solid substance. So this canaliculi allows for things to connect, or I guess to connect each lacunae to each other and that central canal so things can be processed properly in the cell. So this is what we were talking about. So this circular portion right here, this concentric circle, is one osteon. And so the matrix portion is called the lamella, so the solid portion. And then in this you can see, well, you can see right here that there is a blood vessel poking through. That's the central canal. So here is a central canal that's been cut open so you can see internally. This is the central canal. And then you have these Volkmann's or perforating canals that go through at right angles so that we can get a good blood supply all the way through the bone itself. So when you're looking at this, you just need to understand that there are basically canals or tubes that are running through, and then there are these canaliculi that are even smaller that I will show you in a moment. So this is what I'm talking about, where we have the osteocyte that's living in a little lacunae, and then we have, this is the lamella, so this is the matrix portion, this would be more lamella and more lamella. And then you can see here that there are these cracks in the actual, or outside of the lacunae itself. Those are the canaliculi that are going to allow for the cell to get rid of waste, to get nutrients, and then cells to communicate with one another. This is what it actually looks like underneath the microscope. And we're looking at the top of an osteon. So this whole circular portion is an osteon. Here's the central or Haversian canal. This would be a little lacunae where we have an osteocyte living. And then you can see these little fine cracks. They're kind of dark little cracks, and those are the canaliculi off of those lacunae. Now, there are two basic composition or chemical composition or composites making up the bone. We have an organic portion and an inorganic portion. Remember, the inorganic portion is going to be that matrix. And so we have osteoblasts. Blast always means, I always say, baby bone cells. They're basically immature cells, so they're bone forming cells. Osteocytes, mature bone cells. Osteoclasts, we'll get to their function a little bit down the road, but they're large cells that can resorb or break down bone matrix. They're going to be breaking down bone matrix and releasing the calcium that is formed or that is being stored in the bone. And then we have something called an osteoid, and that is unmineralized bone matrix. So in the mineralized bone matrix portion is hard. It makes the bone hard. This is unmineralized bone matrix, and it's made up of glycoproteins, which is just a sugar-covered protein, and collagen fibers. And then the inorganic composition of bone are the mineral salts, and this is just a fancy word for mineral salts, hydroxyapatites, and they are the hard portion. This is where we're going to get the hardness to the bone and the solid portion of the bone. You might want to highlight this. It makes up about 65% of bone, mainly calcium phosphates. We need this calcium for nervous system communication and also muscle contraction. And I already mentioned that it gives the bone the hard, compact, solid characteristics.